In today's Archive Annex video, we look at the history and the unique user-driven indie scene surrounding the Bally Professional Arcade. What is the first thing that comes to mind when you think about a home video game console? Maybe it's the controller, the ease of getting a game running, your favorite games, spending time playing with friends. If you're the type of person who follows industry news, maybe you're keeping up with sales figures, release dates, developers, and studios. But how many think about what they want to program into their home game system today? Another thought experiment. What differentiates a home video game system from a home computer? They both run games, they both can use controllers, and usually, though not always, they've got defined system specifications. But one thing that usually sets them apart is what you can do with a computer. Home game consoles are typically walled gardens, where you buy what's sold from the company that makes it, along with any third-party companies that decide there's money to be made there. A computer, on the other hand, is something where you can write your own programs, or maybe work with some productivity software if you want. But back in 1978, Bally released a home video game console that straddled these lines, and while it never saw much commercial success, it sparked a die-hard community of enthusiasts who reverse-engineered the system and started making, and even selling, their own art programs, music demos, word processors, and yes, video games. We're talking about the Bally Professional Arcade, which was either an expensive, high-end video game system, or the cheapest retail home computer you could get in 1978, depending on your perspective. But first, a little background on the Bally Arcade itself. While Bally was the original publisher, the hardware design and most of the retail video games came from Dave Nutting Associates, an Illinois-based developer that was behind several mid-1970s Bally Midway arcade games like Gunfight, 280's Zap, and Amazing Maze. Prior to Gunfight, all commercially released arcade games used transistor logic, making DNA pioneers in this new technology. But a microprocessor still needed other circuitry for the display and I/O, a situation that did not satisfy DNA's hardware engineer Jeff Fredrickson. Working with Brian Taylor at AMI, they developed custom chips that could do what previously required TTL circuitry, and while Fredrickson designed these primarily for the coin-op space, he further designed out a home video game system using these chips as a potential product. Despite having no experience in the video game consumer market, Bally agreed to take on the system. The system's hardware design was remarkable for the time, running a Z80 microprocessor alongside the custom chips, 4 kilobytes of memory, a 256 color palette, and a relatively high-resolution graphics for the time. The Bally Arcade was a powerhouse in its day that was more than capable of running pretty close approximations of arcade hits. The system featured 4 controller ports with several 4-player games. The controllers themselves are remarkably well designed, with a pistol grip form factor, a trigger button, and a knob on top that functions both as a joystick and as a spinner. And truly setting the system apart from its competition, the Bally Arcade included a 24-key keypad on the front and, hidden behind some knockout panels, an expansion slot and light pen jack on the back that Fredrickson added with the idea that this could eventually have a keyboard attached so one could use the arcade as a home computer. The system has been called the Neo Geo of its day, and while that may be a bit of exaggeration, it certainly outclassed competing offerings from Fairchild, RCA, Atari, and Magnavox by a pretty wide margin. Developers who worked on retail games for the BPA and other platforms, such as Bob Octon, remarked to me that nothing compared until the ColecoVision hit stores in 1982. All this power came with a premium price tag, though, as it retailed for $300 at its launch. Mail-order retailer JS&A started advertising the system in mid-1977 for a fall launch, taking in pre-orders. On the software side of things, engineer Jamie Fenton was put in charge of development of the operating system and built-in programs. A task she noted to me was not her forte, as she hated managing a team. This was particularly stressful as they had to ensure there were no major bugs in these programs, given the sheer price tag that would come with needing to recall consoles to pop in the new OS. Fenton herself programmed in the calculator and scribbling program, while other staff handled the home conversions of coin-op games Checkmate and Gunfight to the platform. Because the home system used much of the same hardware as the arcade originals, Fenton said it wasn't too difficult to simply use the source code from Gunfight and Checkmate's arcade originals to make these home ports as accurate as possible. Almost immediately, the Bally Arcade ran into problems. The system struggled to get to a point where it could receive FCC approval for sale, as at the time the agency had extremely strict rules around radio frequency emissions from home electronics. The DNA engineers got around this by essentially encasing the system in a metal coffin, though this exacerbated cooling issues the system already suffered from. This ended up delaying the release of the Bally Arcade, with the first units reportedly not shipping until the tail end of 1977 into January. Bally also had manufacturing problems, with machines routinely failing the quality assurance checks through the spring of 1978. Enthusiast Bob Fabris wrote in a 2001 retrospective that he recalled seeing a pile of motherboards 8 feet high. Based on reporting in Video Games magazine circa April 1983, these reliability issues continued to dog the platform for months after supposedly being corrected in manufacturing. This essentially killed any momentum the system may have had to begin with. But Bally, and DNA, which Bally acquired in December 1977, still had plans for the machine that would turn it into a full-fledged computer. These plans were part of Fredrickson's original design with the expansion port. Eventually known as the Add-Under, this would have added a full keyboard, additional memory, and access to a Z80-based version of the GRASS computer language, best known today for being the language that the Death Star animation from Star Wars was written in. Dr. Tom DeFanti, the author of the original GRASS programming language, was brought in to work on the Z80 version after one of his grad students, Larry Lesky, got a job at Bally. DeFanti told me he was extremely impressed by the graphics chip in the Bally Arcade and agreed to work on this, quickly developing the Z-GRASS language alongside Jamie Fenton and Nola Donato, a language programmer in her own right. DeFanti remembered demoing the computer add-on multiple times over the years before ultimately spinning it off into a separate product, the Datamax UV1, which was well received by those working on video art and in the broadcast world. The Z-GRASS add-under for the arcade would be delayed essentially until the system left the market in 1983 through a series of cost reduction redesigns. But thanks to Fenton trying to get out of another project, Bally users weren't completely left in the lurch. Fenton was asked to write a demonstration program for the Winter Consumer Electronics Show in January 1978 by her bosses, but she didn't really want to. Around the same time, she'd gotten a hold of a book by Li Chen Wang about Palo Alto Tiny Basic, a version of the BASIC computer language that could run using small amounts of system resources. Deciding that sounded like a more interesting project, over the course of a week, Fenton did a conversion of Tiny Basic for the Bally Arcade, resulting in an initial demo of Bally Basic. Unfortunately for her, she finished this conversion so quickly, she was still stuck writing a demonstration program for the show anyway. But Bally also showcased her Tiny Basic demo to a great deal of interest. She was asked to make this into a commercial product, which she said took quite a bit of clever coding. To save on space, Bally Basic stores the code on the screen itself, essentially hiding it within the display using what Fenton described as a hack on the color map. There would be limitations. Users could only access less than 2 kilobytes of the system's memory, and only had access to 2 colors at a time, but it worked. Crucially, Fredrickson had also designed a 300 baud cassette interface that plugged into the LightPen port, allowing users to save and load software using a standard cassette tape deck. Starting in October 1978, users could purchase the Bally Basic cartridge and the cassette interface, and this is where the Bally user community really diverged from those of its competitors. In 1978, professional arcade owner Bob Fabris started up a small newsletter known as the Arcadians to share some news about the system and its retail releases. Following the release of the BASIC cartridge, this was retooled into a full-fledged newsletter that not only included news about the system from the developers and manufacturers, but also described how it functioned under the hood using the BASIC cartridge as a guide. Users started sending in type-in programs for people to try out, while others with engineering backgrounds started tracing out the pins on the expansion port for their own ends. Fenton remembered meeting one such engineer, John Perkins, at a trade show. Perkins reportedly showed her his own breakdown of the system's OS and found better comments on the code than what her team had internally. Perkins would eventually come to work for DNA's home video game spin-off company Action Graphics, but not before supporting the arcade hobbyist scene in his own way alongside his father Clyde. Part 1. The Corporate Story. The pipeline of official software fell off quickly after the first year. A respectable 9 cartridges came out in 1978 for the platform, including Bally Basic, conversions of Midway arcade games like 280 Zap, Seawolf, Tornado Baseball, and Clowns, and a few console titles like Letter Match. Yet shortly after the new year, Bally reported that it sold only about 28,000 arcade consoles in 1978, kicking off several years of struggles on the retail side of the platform. Only 5 new games shipped in 1979, including an excellent 4-player football game, a conversion of Amazing Maze, and at the tail end of the year, a take on Space Invaders that wound up being rebranded after Atari announced exclusive home rights the following February. While we don't have any reported numbers for 1979, they were clearly not good, as Bally announced it was willing to offload its consumer products division mere weeks into 1980. After negotiations with Fidelity Electronics fell through in March, come September, Bally finally signed an agreement with Ohio-based Astrovision, later known as Astrocade, to license out the hardware for a 5-year period. Further, Astrovision had the rights to continue selling it with the Bally name through 1981 and gained the home console license for several Midway coin-op games, such as Space Zap, Wizard of War, and Galaxian, though Atari would later undermine that by negotiating the rights with Namco directly. Astrovision did have to pay Bally royalties for carts and consoles sold as part of this deal. Astrovision published a single game for 1980, a home conversion of Midway's Dog Patch, shortly after taking over the console. Former Astrovision product manager Tom Meeks relayed to me that his understanding is that Bally recognized the home game system was doing poorly, didn't know how to market it, and made it the scapegoat in a federal investigation of criminal connections by cutting the consumer division loose. But no one has been able to corroborate this story. Fabris provided a different take in his 2001 retrospective, noting that this decision coincided with Bally's retail partners losing interest in working with the company, and with it turning its corporate attention to casino gambling in Atlantic City. This is echoed in an April 1983 retrospective on the troubles the platform faced in Video Games magazine, where Dave Nutting offered his thoughts, adding that Bally never quite came to grips that the game console was a whole new product unlike a television or an arcade machine, with different needs on the end-user side. While we don't have any reported numbers for 1980 sales, Astrovision reported selling 70,000 arcade units in 1981, enough to be profitable to the tune of about $1 million, but still very small numbers compared to the estimated 3.1 million VCS units market leader Atari sold over the same time frame, or the nearly 680,000 in televisions Mattel sold that same year. Nevertheless, it soon became clear that Astrovision was too small an operation and rife with internal political struggles, according to former staffer Tom Meeks, to give the system the distribution it needed. At the time Meeks joined the company, leading up Astrovision were 2 men. Ray George managed the marketing and sales side of things as vice president of sales, while Jim Gurin managed the company overall as the eventual CEO. While there were a series of company presidents and other high-level executives, Fabris remarked in his retrospective that George always struck him as the true power behind the throne, a view that Meeks' perspective seems to echo. Meeks worked closely with the former, and remembered George as being a remarkably charismatic salesman who was able to placate angry distributors with ease, but also one focused more on his own bottom line than the company's overall health. Essentially, Meeks recalled, George received a percentage of consoles and cartridges sold, and he'd use this to his own advantage by onboarding new distributors, selling them on consoles and cartridges, and then shipping them the less popular games rather than the really good stuff. The distributor would balk, Meeks said, George would find them in violation of the sales contract, and would go off to find a new distributor for the same general area to sell more product to. George unfortunately passed away some years ago, so we'll never hear his side of the story. But from Meeks' point of view, their distributors and sales reps were great, but there were clearly structural problems in delivering product. As for Gurin, Meeks had very little interaction with him save for just enough to grasp the animosity between the 2 men. Gurin had been one of the original investors brought on for the $1.6 million professional arcade deal with Bally, and wanted to be sure his investment paid off. Below the top-level executives, Meeks served as the point of contact for DNA's software team, working closely with Fenton and Bob Ogden, the eventual head of Action Graphics, while Astrovision's hardware guy Jim McConnell worked with Fredrickson on the computer add-on and an updated BASIC cartridge that had a 2000 baud cassette interface built into it, which shipped in 1981 and became colloquially known as Astro Basic.
And the second version I liked even better because I was able to double the speed of execution. I came up with some hacks for, like one of the hacks I came up with that really helped was I basics. What I did is I just did the whole line of code and kept that in the buffer, and then all the code that did it didn't have to make a subroutine call and do that combination and come back. It could just dispatch from the memory directly, so it was much faster. So that was the latter version I did, which was sort of the best of the best.
Besides that major upgrade to the old BASIC cart, Astrovision shipped 4 other cartridges in 1981, including home conversions of Midway's Galaxian and Space Zap, as well as another 3 in 1982, The Incredible Wizard, aka The Wizard of War, Pirate's Chase, and a cartridge version of John Perkins' Artillery Duel, which he'd originally written in Bally Basic. As previously alluded to, Dave Nutting Associates spun off Action Graphics in 1982 to focus on the home video game products while DNA directed its energy at Coin-Op Games. While independent, the shareholders of Action Graphics were the owners of DNA. Bob Ogden was tapped to lead this small company, which early on worked pretty much exclusively for Astrocade, but eventually expanded out to other platforms.
Dave Nutting came to me and said, Bob, I know you're I was managing this whole shop, doing a lot of coin at the time. Because I know you really like the consumer. If I'll give you a portion of the ownership if you want to go and run a software group called Action Graphics to create games for the Astrocade. And you have an exclusive contract to create all the games.
1981 was a successful year for the platform, as Astrovision came close to hitting their sales and financial targets for the year, and the mood was bullish entering 1982 within the company and the broader gaming space. This attitude did not last for long that year. Astrovision, rebranded to Astrocade shortly into 1982, needed some additional funds, as bankruptcy filings indicate that maintaining their stock of components to manufacture was quite an expense on the company overall going back into 1981. Gorin used another company he started alongside military supplier McDonnell Douglas, called Nitron, to take over manufacturing in the middle of the year. Nitron had been involved with Astrocade starting around March as Astrocade worked to get a handle on production, but really got linked into this process around June. Starting at that time, Nitron would purchase the components as well as the existing stock of cartridges and consoles from Astrocade, assembling the parts into the finished product and then selling them all back to Astrocade. Essentially, Gorin was paying himself for the production. Meeks said this led to power politics in the company as Gorin tried to use this leverage to minimize George's sway, and this also made Astrocade very reliant on Nitron's performance as a company, even as its own internal manufacturing facilities were now being overseen by Nitron. If the latter had issues, Astrocade would have issues. By 1982, it was clear that the only way for the professional arcade to truly get the distribution and marketing oomph it needed, as well as to get Nitron off their backs, was for Astrocade to sell itself to another bigger company. To that end, George began negotiating with Quaker Oats, which owned Fisher-Price, and Hasbro, as two of the largest toy companies in the industry at the time and both seeing dollar signs in the video game space. The stage seemed set for the machine to finally get its due. Quaker Oats even purchased a 13% stake in Astrocade with the option of acquiring the full company later. But both deals fell through at the 11th hour. Meeks said that the company had been negotiating with Fisher-Price when they had made a $3 million tentative offer to buy out Astrocade. At the same time, Hasbro started negotiations with George. Following Meeks' demonstration of the hardware in George's sales pitch, Hasbro similarly made a $3 million offer, at which point George noted that they had gotten a similar offer already from Fisher-Price and wanted to see how this panned out. This angered the Hasbro representatives, who didn't like that George did this sales pitch with an existing tentative offer on the table with another company. As for the Fisher-Price deal, that too fell through when news leaked out about it and an overly enthusiastic fan called Fisher-Price to congratulate them. As Meeks tells it, Fisher-Price was spooked that word had leaked out and backed out of the deal on their end as well. At this point, Meeks and George found themselves meeting with anyone remotely interested, including executives from Marvel Comics, but no one was biting until they turned across the Atlantic to Europe. George and Meeks met with representatives from ITT, who they convinced that a PAL version of the professional arcade hardware was entirely doable. Fredrickson put together a PAL-friendly version of the video chip, and ITT agreed to become the European distributor for the console for $3 million, which would be enough to keep Nitron off their necks, Meeks said. This deal, in turn, fell apart when George called business columnist Dan Dorfman at their shared hotel room to tell him that the Nitron deal was in trouble, as Astrocade couldn't pay them, essentially to keep Nitron busy while they finalized the deal in a few weeks. The day of this final meeting at an investment bank in New York, Meek said things were going well until one of the investors offhandedly mentioned Dorfman's new column, that rather than taking fire at Nitron, instead wrote extensively about Astrocade's financial struggles and likely impending insolvency. This upset the West German ITT representative, who promptly left the meeting, taking the investment bankers with him and in turn leaving Astrocade in the lurch. Bankruptcy filings suggest that another issue is that Astrocade simply didn't have the money to finalize the design of a PAL-compatible data chip. Quaker Oats exited its ownership stake in Astrocade around the same time, leaving the company with a $3 million gap in its ledger.
Nitron stock fell through the floor. We weren't selling. Our distributors and reps, after reading that article, quit buying. Just everything fell apart, both for Nitron and for us. And that's why we went under. That phone call is why we fell under.
Sure enough, Astrocade's fortunes collapsed not long after this failed deal. The company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy at the end of 1982, managing to slip out 2 final first-party games in August as the company developed potential new routes towards profitability before being swallowed up in a sea of debt. The company's failure also brought down Nitron, which was forced to reorganize in a bailout and sell off its stock of arcade merchandise to whoever would take it, and leave the video game industry behind. Briefly, the companies looked at foreign markets as a way to deal with the debt brought on by Astrocade's 1982 flameout, and Bob Fabris reported that R&D work got underway designing new chips that could work with differing voltages and both PAL and NTSC video signals. But Astrocade's final end in mid-1984 brought a halt to these dreams. Nitron followed suit soon after, closing out all remaining arcade stock in 1985 and shutting down.
It cost us $120 to manufacture the motherboard alone. How could we compete with Atari selling for $129 or Mattel's $50 rebate? When Astrocade was formed in 1980, Atari was around $200 and Intellivision was up around $299. Back then, at least we had a chance. Elena Quintana, Astrocade spokesperson.
Action Graphics continued to produce new software for other game consoles. For example, the Beam Rider conversion to ColecoVision was done by their design team, as was Winter Games for the Commodore 64. But eventually it too wound down, with Ogden and others moving on to the budding CD-ROM software market. Dave Nutting Associates as a whole closed up shop in the mid-1980s as the coin-op market shrank, though Nutting himself stayed busy designing tractors and penning a pair of books on topics of interest. Video games in April 1983 estimated about 100,000 professional arcade units were in homes at that time, and the August 1983 edition of the Astrobugs newsletter estimated about 120,000 professional arcade consoles had been sold overall. These would suggest some very minuscule sales in 1982, if remotely accurate. Based on bankruptcy filings, it appears that the rights to the console and its library reverted back to Bally in 1985 when the license agreement expired, and nothing has been done commercially with either since. But while that may have been the end of the console's corporate life, outside of the sell-through of merchandise over the following couple of years, its hobbyist scene, thriving for years in the background, has kept those fires lit right up to today. Part 2. The History of the Arcadians. The story of the console's user base in some ways starts with Bob Fabris, who started the aforementioned Arcadian newsletter in 1978. This isn't to say that Fabris single-handedly is responsible for the scene that sprouted around the console, but his newsletter found an audience very quickly, turning from a small 2-pager to multi-page monthly affairs that were mailed out regularly until 1986. And this audience, in turn, was able to connect with each other thanks in part to his newsletter, advertisements for which soon started being packed in with the professional arcade console itself.
My full-time job as a systems engineer with Lockheed required frequent cross-country trips. I was able to influence meeting dates, which enabled me to attend conventions and meetings that featured Bally participation, usually on weekends. As a result, I had many opportunities to meet Bally and DNA personnel at various CESs in Chicago and Las Vegas, and this helped in the production of the Arcadian. I was also able to have a booth at various West Coast computer fairs in San Francisco. By renting a couple of TVs and bringing the BPA, local subscribers and I could show off various games, etc. Bob Fabris.
Fabris himself had the help of a few local computer experts. Production itself was a one-man job that took him a given weekend to finish. He used a hand-wired Apple II for the text, and a Comprint printer connected directly to the Apple II to get physical pages for the print shop to assemble. Later on, he used his Bally arcade console, once Fenton surreptitiously passed along the Bally Hacker's Guide that included instructions on connecting a printer to it. Another newsletter, known initially as The Cursor before changing its name to Basic Express, provided another venue for users to exchange information and programs in the machine's peak years. Between the two, a user could learn a lot on how to program for the machine, how it functioned, and try their hand at typing in a variety of programs submitted to either of them. Furthermore, some of these developers took to selling their games as type-in listings, as full programs on cassette tape, and in some cases, in retail shops. The system's architecture, power, and accessibility attracted those who particularly had backgrounds with computers or engineering. As such, user groups sprouted up in various parts of the country, Southeast Michigan, Chicago, Maryland, Buffalo, among others, where enthusiasts got together to swap tips and talk shop. These sorts of user groups were common among computer hobbyists, but rare for home game consoles, further expressing how the existence of Fenton's basic cartridge blurred the line for the system. Consider Brett Bilbray, a recent University of Michigan undergrad drawn to the system because of its Z80 microprocessor. In high school, Bilbray had built his own Pong home system for an electrical engineering class, and was interested in checking out microprocessors, with the Z80 interesting him most in particular.
I wanted to learn as much as possible about the Bally Arcade, and I found out there was a newsletter that was being started, The Arcadian. So I subscribed to the newsletter. But I found out that I knew more about the arcade, so I submitted a few articles on how to do things. 3-tone music player, machine-level programming, graphics examples. I found out that there were other folks near me that had bought Bally arcades and had formed a user group, Michigan Astro BUGs, or Bally User Group. So I started attending meetings and getting involved with them. I was able to meet a few folks that were able to help teach me a few things. Brett Bilbray.
As mentioned, Fenton published what's known as the Bally Hacker's Guide through the Arcadian newsletter. This document listed additional commands not included in the official manual and methods of accessing the console's built-in programs and BIOS using the basic cartridge. In doing so, Fenton provided a key component in improving the quality of the games people were developing using it. BASIC is not a particularly fast programming language, especially on a constrained platform such as the BPA. But using these commands, programmers could access machine language routines that existed in the system already, speeding up calculations or pulling from useful bits of code to make their programs move more smoothly. The next step from here, of course, was having people write their own machine language routines. The first such opportunities for a broader audience came through Andy Guevara's Machine Language Manager cartridge and associated tutorials, published in the Arcadian. Guevara had been turned onto the platform due to its dedicated hardware for graphics and sound, which were unusual at the time. And since he was already familiar with the Z80 microprocessor, delving into the machine's inner workings was right in his wheelhouse. Reverse engineering the hardware was an arduous process helped precipitously, he said, when someone shared with him the console's system ROM description, which led to him creating the MLM cartridge. While the MLM wasn't a major success, he remembers selling only about 100 cartridges, it led to a series of machine language games and even an attempt by Guevara to turn this hobby into a full-time job. Bilbray was among the first hobbyists to produce a commercial cartridge for the platform beyond Guevara's MLM, having been able to delve into true machine language coding on the platform early on by reverse engineering the machine with the basic cartridge and studying the code used in commercial games such as football. His first game was ICBM Attack, inspired by Missile Command, and published in June 1982 through the Arcadian. This used a specially built analog controller designed by his friends that plugged into 2 controller ports to use the paddle pins for the X and Y axes. With Guevara's MLM and tutorials, however, developers started recognizing that even some machine language routines within a basic program would be a boon. Fully machine language programs like Guevara's Chicken, Esoterica's Super Slope, and Road Toad could be loaded through Astro Basic, while other games like L&M Software's Candyman and Exetor's Revenge used machine language routines to run more smoothly, with thanks to Guevara for his help. L&M would later collaborate directly with Guevara on a few cartridge releases that used full machine language routines, Ms. Candyman, and Sea Devils.
Sure. Ms. Candyman was a collaboration between me and L&M Software. Those guys were creative. Oh, man. I had the technical smarts, but I'm not creative. And so they had the ideas for games and things that were, beyond my ability to think in that capability, So they had the nice ideas for the games, and I helped them with the, creating a cartridge from scratch. One of the things that required was me going out and getting a mold made for the cartridges. In retrospect, I probably could have bought them straight from Midway, but it didn't occur to me. So I had spent the money, and I had boards made to receive the chips that I was programming. And I found a cheap source of memory chips for those. And so between us, with my technical stuff, I could take their game and we would go back and forth on the mechanics, how's it working, is it meeting what they're doing, and they would take and make changes on their own. They had their own system, and we'd go back and forth. It was a pretty cool collaboration. So Candyman worked out pretty good.
The cassette format also eventually allowed for a few multi-load games, notably Mike White's Quadra. This featured multiple minigames that the player had to clear to win, largely based on existing arcade games like Head-On or Astro Fighter. His original game, included on the pack Safecracker, started off as his attempt at using machine language routines for everything, but he noted in an interview with me that those tended to go over his head, so he stuck with BASIC for the rest of his productions. I'd mentioned that some of these user-created games wound up in retail shops, and that was certainly true for local retailers, such as ABC Hobbycraft in Indiana, where Bally users in the broader region congregated for new products even after Astrocade's demise. Scott Collins of the store, which still exists to this day, told me that sales actually increased over time as fewer retailers stocked product for the console, with the Incredible Wizard being a huge smash in particular. Third-party games sold by the hobbyists also did well for them, although the only one that sold as well as first-party titles were reproductions of the unreleased Pac-Man clone, Munchie. But there was a concerted effort to even get some of these into bigger retail chains, such as the case of Wavemakers and Montgomery Ward. Wavemakers was the label used by Mike Peace, who developed games and sold them on cassette out of his house.
The Bally system was the first time I tried to program. I found it to be pretty easy. Every time I would do something on it, it worked, so I just got more excited to see what else I could do. Every time I created a game, I felt a sense of pride. My family still talks about it. They did the testing for bugs, and my wife and I did the hard work, packaging and getting it to distributors. Mike Peace.
Peace also played in a band, and eventually recruited his drummer, Rick Flesh, to help him sell the game to retail channels. Flesh recognized that Montgomery Ward was one of the bigger retailers for the professional arcade console itself, and with about a dozen Wavemakers games under Peace's belt by this point, it would be a lucrative opportunity for them to sell tapes.
We thought it was a good idea. So we put together a presentation. I found out who we needed to talk to. I had no inhibitions picking up the phone and calling them, and got a meeting. We went in, we did a presentation, and the guy loved the product, absolutely loved it. He was a little bit concerned with the size of our group, essentially two couples trying to pull this off. And he gave us essentially a list of things that we had to have to make this work for him. High-speed duplication capabilities, customer service, product liability insurance, and a few other things. And nothing really insurmountable. So over a period of a couple of weeks, we actually went and Mike bought a number of high-speed duplicators, and probably the biggest challenge we had was finding somebody to do underwrite product liability insurance, because it was essentially a cassette tape. Unfortunately, at that time, some other things happened that Wards decided they probably really weren't going to continue selling the unit.
Beyond games, these basic and machine language routines proved popular for art programs. The arcade had been a target for digital art going back to Jamie Fenton's 1979 digital TV dinner glitch art exhibition, but a number of art programs came up from people testing out the console's graphical capabilities. These started off with simple shapes, but eventually evolved into more impressive displays. George Moses, a musician, took to using the console's audio capabilities to create what we'd consider now to be chiptune covers of existing songs. Mike White put together the Tin Pants Gang, a cartoon about a surly robot. And even today, developer Rachel Simone Weil has used the graphical capabilities of the professional arcade to make a detailed title screen for a non-existent game. All we're really missing is a version of everyone's favorite demo program, Bad Apple. Still, the most ambitious efforts on the part of these enthusiast users came in the form of hardware expansions. In lieu of the ZGrass-based Adunder, 2 such expansions were sold at the time. The Blue Ram, designed by John Perkins and his father Clyde, and sold through their outfit Perkins Engineering, and the Viper 1 computer add-on. Both were designed with input from Fredrickson, according to Fabris, and used their own specialized forks of Bally Basic designed to access the larger amount of memory available. While it was possible to access the extra RAM through the standard BASIC program, it's an inefficient, limited, and onerous process. Fenton told me that she polled arcade users on what kind of improvements they'd like to see in the BASIC program, and overwhelmingly the response was additional memory. So after Alternative Engineering and Perkins Engineering each approached her about their respective products, she developed a variance on Bally Basic that looked for the additional memory where each device had it mapped out. There are not many extant ViperSoft BASIC programs, but Blue RAM, having arrived first and in several RAM sizes, saw some decent support. The extra memory allowed for more colorful programs, more robust graphics, and faster play even without machine language routines, and some of the later Blue RAM programs were truly impressive for 1970s hardware.
I made a version called Hot Rod Bally Basic, which was designed to be bigger, to run on an add-on type system like Perkins created the Blue RAM. It had 4-color graphics rather than 2-color graphics, and it used different memory areas for the program, so it was really fast. And because of the way I structured things, it didn't have much effort to get that to work.
And of course, Astrocade was well aware of the enthusiast base around the platform. Hobbyists were frequent guests at the company's trade show appearances, and Astrocade even contracted Perkins Engineering to help finalize and get the ZGrass computer Adunder out the door in 1982. Meeks, having used both a Datamax UV1 and the in-development ZGrass Adunder, remarked that the latter had a tendency to run rather slowly due to the more limited amount of memory and slower microprocessor compared to the standalone UV1 unit. Nevertheless, he did remark that the ZGrass Adunder unit was completed and ready to go out the door when Astrocade ran out of money. Alternative Engineering, meanwhile, negotiated to use ZGrass in its new Viper system add-on, to be released in late 1983. According to the Arcadian, it appears a couple of these may have actually been sold, but it is unclear, speaking with some of the old hands from that period, if these were finished products or just prototype builds that were sold off after the bottom fell out of the market. Bally Basic also served as the target platform for some educational studies as well. Meek said that he was very interested in educational software, and worked with the University of Maryland Center for Young Children on a project using the platform. Alongside doctoral candidate June Wright, he wrote some simple basic games for kindergarten-age children to see if video games could be used to enhance educational practices. While he unfortunately doesn't still have those programs, he still looks back on the project very fondly. When Astrocade started winding down in 1983, so too did the enthusiast scene. No longer could they rely on fresh systems being sold to attract new members, and existing users slowly drifted away. A few unreleased, and in some cases not quite finished games that were in development from DNA and Action Graphics made their way to enthusiasts and copies sold in small production runs through the newsletters. These ranged from highly anticipated or ambitious programs like Conan the Barbarian or Munchie, which Astrocade opted not to sell after seeing Atari's litigation against Philips for Casey Munchkin, or simpler earlier programs like Checkers or Soccer. Still, the 1983 Astro Bash took place one fall weekend in Michigan, essentially an opportunity for the Bally enthusiast community to all come together and celebrate their love of the system. It featured live music by George Moses, a showcase of new hobbyist games, including a new cartridge, Sneaky Snake, being put up for sale, as well as games, food, and booze. Nearly everyone I've talked to for this video has fond memories of the Astro Bash, which drew in enthusiasts from as far away as Maryland, with Astrocade's Tom Meeks joining in the festivities. A smaller event followed it in 1984, but the Astro Bash remains a singular event practically unique in console gaming. A small convention to celebrate a single games machine and the people who made it truly special.
Yeah, maybe we were. Oh, did you do a cookout or something for that? Yes. Yes. Oh my goodness, I completely forgot about it. So yeah, there were several groups set up outside. It was just guys hanging out in the yard having a blast. There were a couple TVs set up running the Valley games. That was the Astro Bash? Yeah, it's awesome. Yeah. I was there. I didn't even know I was there. But yes, now it's coming back. Holy cow. This was just a collection of great guys hanging out, having a good time, writing code, eating hot dogs, and being nerds together. That's what drove it.
With console sales dwindling, fewer people were subscribing to the Arcadian, by then the last vestige of the arcade's once robust newsletter scene, and it dropped its production rate from monthly to a few times a year before finally being put to bed in 1986 with the last handful of games being advertised. In these final quarterly editions of the newsletter, Mike White designed and sold the Basic Cart, an auto-booting cartridge containing a basic game on it, which he said sold about 120 units. But the enthusiast scene remains. Many of the folks who subscribed and were involved in the scene have remained friends, and continue to discuss the platform in the Bally Alley email user group. Bally Alley's Adam Triunfo has been diligent in cataloging the history of the machine, and having secured Fabris's document collection in the early 2000s has slowly scanned newsletters, correspondence, advertisements, press coverage, cartridges, cassettes, and pretty much everything else Fabris held on to. Others have focused on digitizing cassette games and reaching out to those formerly involved to interview and see if they have any materials they'd be willing to share. A handful of homebrew games have been created for the console, notably War and Crazy Climber by Michael Garber, as well as a development cartridge designed by Rachel Simone Weil. Still others, myself included, also work on typing in programs that are otherwise unpreserved to help some of these basic programs live again. Emulators didn't cover much of the arcade's library until MAME added in support for the RAM expansion in the 2000 baud interface in 2019, so while 300 baud programs are still trapped on original hardware, most everything else is accessible with just a few keystrokes. Ken Lill, who'd been working on the platform and writing programming tutorials since the early 80s, developed the Little White RAM expansion and commensurate multicart, allowing ready access to expanded memory programs that otherwise would be difficult to play pre-emulation. He even wrote a new tutorial column in 2021 looking at code efficiency. The only comparable situation in the console space to the professional arcade and its hobbyists may be the Famicom and Family Basic, another method for users to access console hardware and make some truly inventive games with limited space and memory. I cannot speak to how influential Family Basic may have been in Japan, but in the US, some of the folks who cut their teeth on Bally Basic went on to do some cool stuff in the gaming space. John Perkins, who turned his interest in Bally Basic into a job with Action Graphics, would later go on to work with Tom Meeks, Rob Fulop, Nolan Bushnell, and others on Hasbro's Nemo project, a game machine using VHS tape technology. The games for that tech that were produced, like Sewer Shark and Night Trap, later became touchstones of the FMV craze in the 1990s. Brett Bilbray, who similarly worked on games with Action Graphics, went into the tech industry, eventually working at Apple and becoming one of the leads on developing the iPad. Dave and Ben Eibach, a father and son developer team from Michigan, produced the cult classic 90s PC game trilogy Arlo's Adventure, basing the first game off of an existing game they liked and developing the sequels from scratch. While Ben moved into a career in healthcare, Dave still occasionally develops games. And Blizzard co-founder Mike Morhaime told me he got his start with Bally Basic, learning to type in games from the newsletters and manual and seeing how code works.
That was my first exposure to programming. And I remember getting the basic cartridge and reading that manual, and my mind was just blown about. I thought it was the coolest thing ever. Of course, I really didn't know what I could do with it. And then shortly after, I get this letter in the mail. So I must have gotten on some list of the Arcadian newsletter. And every issue of that newsletter that came out, I just remember getting so excited to read it because he cared about the same things that I cared about. I cared about what can you do with this machine, what are the hidden secrets, and give me some additional programs I could type in and get it to do interesting things.
While the Bally Professional Arcade never quite made the mass market splash its producers envisioned, it nevertheless remains one of the most fascinating machines of its day, and one well worth exploring in more detail. Special thanks to the folks I spoke to for this video, as well as those who have done their part to maintain the system's history and legacy. Finally, a salute to the late Bob Fabris and Dave Nutting, without whom we would not have this video.